Hello, everyone. My name is David Shurter. I am author of Rabbit Hole, a satanic ritual abuse survivor story, which details my father's activities as a child abductor and our family's friends who are involved with gun running, drug trafficking, and child abductions. I am currently an artist. I live in a quiet life with my soulmate and two dogs in the Midwest. I have a website that you can read further on my ordeals, which is www.davidshurter, SHURT, as in Tom, ER.com. About a couple months ago perhaps, I was at a human trafficking conference and a question came up as to who we were fighting to stop child trafficking. The question came up, who is they? And I am joined with Felicity Lee today, who came and we got together and decided to figure out maybe who they are or what we're looking at and what is causing this epidemic of human trafficking proportions. So Felicity, do you want to introduce yourself?
Okay. I'm Felicity Lee. I'm the owner of IGDID.com or Ivory Garden. It's an online community for child abuse survivors. I'm a survivor of child abuse myself. I hold degrees in psychology. I'm an avid researcher. I hold a teaching certificate, and I'm a retired special education teacher. I enjoy writing poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. I love to research, and I enjoy arts and crafts, and I have two grown boys.
Very good.
I'm also interested in, over time, as I've watched it, the child abuse statistics have skyrocketed. Every single day in the news, there's huge groups of this human trafficking. So I'm really excited to be doing this.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be working with you. Your research is impeccable. I can personally attest to that. So we have an introduction. This presentation focuses on how and why child abuse/exploitation has become rampant and seemingly unchecked worldwide. We will begin with the first comprehensive law, CAPTA, from 1974, which has affected the history of child protection. Next, we're going to move on to the current statistics of child abuse and exploitation. We all hear on the news daily the atrocities and horrifying child abuse exploitation that the FBI is bringing to light. And we're going to present just a couple of these cases from the past, as well as take a quick look at the backlash groups who, following 1974, began an oppositional movement against child protective guidelines and how their actions have been effective in swaying public opinion legislation in favor of the perpetrators and abusers. It was said by Katherine Hine, who we will talk about later on in this presentation, that she is quoted as saying, "It is common for and unusual for any reform movement, after it achieves a certain amount of public support in the context of child protection, that opposition movement has come to be known as child advocates as the backlash." And so from now on, what you'll hear, we will not refer to them as they, we will refer to them as the backlash. Now, Felicity likes to call them skeptics. I personally like to call them the pedophile protection squad. But from now on, any time that you hear about it, the group that we are dealing with will be called the backlash. Lastly, we would like to present a bit from the article Retaliation Against Professionals Who Report Child Abuse, written by Katherine Hine, J.D. During our presentation, we will focus on the backlash and how it has been their crusade to define public attitude, legislation, prevent professionals from supporting and or protecting child victims and survivors of child abuse exploitation, which is why child abuse has gone underreported other than overstated, causing our current pandemic of abuse. And so that's the introduction. Felicity and I worked really hard, and this is our first PowerPoint. So at least it's my first PowerPoint. It's not Felicity's first PowerPoint, but she had to work with my small abilities. So please excuse the if it's not quite up to par to what most people would expect on a PowerPoint, because I am just learning and Felicity had to do it simple for me. Felicity, do you want to jump in? You saved me.
You're doing fine.
Okay. The next slide is a question of why. Problem. Recently, we are all becoming acutely aware of child abuse / exploitation that has been happening right under our noses, worldwide as well as in the United States. Why has rampant child abuse and exploitation gone unchecked, underreported, and in secret for so long? And so Felicity and I got together, and she wrote a lot of these are her information, and she went in and started researching. And do you have the PowerPoint in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Why don't you read this one, just because it's your,
Okay. Before the first child protective laws came out, children were considered chattel or property of their parents. And in 1974, Congress enacted the first really major federal legislation that addressed child abuse and neglect in exchange for federal funding for child abuse prevention and treatment. It was called the Child Abuse Preventive and Treatment Act, or CAPTA. Soon after the reported child abuse cases just skyrocketed to amazing numbers, because there was mandatory reporters. Survivors were going in and reporting, abuse from their childhood. Therapists were reporting. What CAPTA did is it provided federal funding in support of prevention, assessment, investigation, prosecution, and treatment activities, and also provided grants to public agencies and nonprofit agencies for demonstration programs and projects. Additionally, it identified the federal role in supporting research, evaluation, technical assistance, and data collection activities, establishing the Office on Child Abuse and Neglect. It mandated the National Clearinghouse of Child Abuse and Neglect Information, also set forth a minimum definition of child abuse and neglect. So, 1974 brought about laws to protect children. So what we were wondering is, if in 1974 these laws became active, then why are the numbers of child abuse cases so high right now?
Which will bring us to our next slide, a few statistics on abuse. And we just put down a few that we thought were interesting and pertinent to this presentation. Approximately 20% of women and 5 to 10% of men report being sexually abused as children, while 25 to 50% of all children report being physically abused. According to the World Health Organization, up to 53,000 children are murdered worldwide each year. In 2002, the World Health Organization estimated that 150 million girls and 73 million boys under 18 experience some form of forced sexual intercourse or violence. 1.8 million are involved in prostitution or pornography, and 1.2 million have been trafficked. And this information comes from Every Child Matters Education Fund. And the child trafficking statistics were as such that 600,000 to 800,000 women, children, and men are bought and sold across international borders every year and exploited for forced labor or commercial sex. 59% are women, 14% are men, 17% are girls, and 10% were boys. Now, being a man, I question sometimes those statistics, because men, as a rule, generally do not report. I've done a lot of research on men and men who have been molested, such as myself, and we have a tendency not to report, and so those statistics could be off. But 50% of those victims that were being exploited were children. And it's estimated 70% of transactions with sex with underage girls start on the internet. There are 20.9 million victims of trafficking worldwide as of 2012. 20.9 million victims. 1.5 million victims are in the United States. And so we're seeing, as Felicity has said, we are seeing atrocious numbers of children being exploited. The Center for Missing and Exploited Children say that 797,500 children younger than 18 were reported missing in 1 year period of time in America. And that results in an average of 2,185 children being reported missing each day. And this number does not include the throwaway kids who leave home unreported, the undocumented poor, nor does it include parents who sell their children, all of which are contributing factors to this ever-growing problem of sex trafficking and exploitation. Do you want to jump in and say anything, Felicity, or?
No, that's pretty much it for that.
Okay. There are implications to child trafficking. The impact of child trafficking. Human trafficking has surpassed the illegal sale of arms. Trafficking will surpass the illegal sale of drugs in the next few years. Drugs are used once and they are gone. Victims of child trafficking can be used over and over and over. My father, who was in the child trafficking, what you need to understand is that you can abduct a child. In 2 to 3 days, you can get that child to sell themselves for sex, make an untold amount of money. When they are no longer valuable in such a way, you can either sell them into slave labor and make a price, or you can sell them into snuff films and make a price. Then their organs are harvested. All of that is underground, and so one child is a gold mine to someone who wants to use that child as an object. And so that's what people don't understand, and that's the reason why the human trafficking is on the rise in all 50 states and has become a $32 billion a year industry itself. 4.5 million people of the that are trafficked are sexually exploited. Up to 300,000 Americans under 18 are lured into the commercial sex trade every year. From 14,500 to 17,500 of those victims are trafficked into the United States each year. The average age of the trafficked victims is 11 to 14. Approximately 80% of the women and children bought, sold, and imprisoned in the underground sex service industry, their average lifespan is 3 to 7 years. Found dead from attack, abuse, HIV, and other STDs, malnutrition, overdose, or suicide. And so people wonder why it's so hard to find victims of this sex trafficking ring. This is why they last 3 to 7 years. According to the National Runaway Switchboard, 1.3 million runaway and homeless youth live on America's street every day. 5,000 die each year. It would not be surprising to learn that the number of children trafficked in the United States is actually much higher than 300,000. Children are often targeted by traffickers as they are deemed easier to manipulate than adults. More money can be earned by younger girls and boys exploited in sexual exploitation, especially virgins. Prepubescent girls are reported to be injected with hormones to bring on puberty. Young girls are exploited to have a greater earning potential, and such are in greater demand, and that comes from the Arc of Hope for Our Children in 2012. The public is now inundated with the flood of child abuse exploitation through news and internet. The current media cases, the FBI just announced Monday that the arrest of 159 people in recovery of 105 children involved in child prostitution rings across the country. The 76-city sweep conducted in the past 3 days represents the largest such law enforcement action forced on children forced into sexual slavery, federal authorities said, 2013. I say it's about time. Felicity, do you want to jump in? Is there anything you want to add to any of this?
Well, this is an interesting case because evidently victims of these men that were sexually abusing these people were calling in and being ignored because of the thinking of today.
Which is what we're going to get into, and we're going to understand a little bit why we're focused as a society, because we really have allowed this to happen. Now, other examples that we're dealing with is Jimmy Savile, the UK celebrity who went unexposed even in the wake of one of the largest phone hacking and spying scandals of stars in Europe. Nobody knew while he was alive that he was involved with this, which I find kind of interesting. Jerry Sandusky, incredibly interesting case. The lone Penn State pedophile who a myriad of people risked their lives and reputations to protect, despite what was known. And so you have all of these people. I believe there's more to the story, because we as a society are really focused to look the other way and to mind our own business. That's the reason why people like Ariel Castro was able to hold 3 women captive for over a decade in Ohio without anyone suspecting anything. Now, it doesn't have to be right in your face. There was a pedophile group called Dream Board. It was an international internet club that had been active for over 40 years, and we all know the internet hasn't been active for 40 years. So these people were able to enact, sell children, abduct children, rape children, and do all of this without the internet. They were connected before the internet. The internet has just really kind of sped everything up and made it a little bit easier for it to all happen. And then we also have institutions called NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, whose motto is sex before 8 or it's too late. Now, most people think this is just a South Park cartoon, made-up cartoon place. And these people are real. And they have a lot of authority and a lot of history in maintaining and helping society to look the other way. But the consequences of turning our back on child abuse and exploitation. Now, this is the case that I really would like, Felicity, for you to jump in on. It's the Rochdale case in Greater Manchester, England. And it was that a new report into the child sex grooming scandal in Rochdale is a damning indictment of the local council, the town's MP said. This review, following the high-profile conviction of 9 Asian men for grooming offenses in May last year, investigated Rochdale Council's response to child sex exploitation in the borough. The 137-page report identified a lack of consistent senior leadership or a lack of vision and direction in the retaliation to sexual abuse exploitation, and that frontline staff did not know what to do about CSE and how to deal with it, which is CSE is child sexual exploitation. The council concedes some children were let down, that their own performance was poor, and admits senior managers failed to show leadership or take responsibility. And Simon Dasnuck, Rochdale's Labour MP, said all they needed to do was listen to the victims. It's really what needs to happen, is that people need to listen to the victims. But as Felicity and I will show, there has been a real push to keep this information from coming out into a public arena, and there are people who are systematically involved in this today. A combination of dismissive attitudes, a toxic culture that viewed rape victims as making lifestyle choices, and excessive bureaucracy that was bereft of common sense, allowed horrible abuse to go on in our borough for far too long. And so my estimation, and I don't know if this is your estimation, Felicity, a lot of it is reinventing the wheel. The girls had reported to the authorities, and their reports were ignored. And what I have seen is that everybody is trying to do their own thing, and no one is connected with anybody else. They're all working separate from each other, and so each one of them are basically reinventing the wheel when they could, if they brought themselves together, would be able to make a significant change. While some organizations were consistently supportive in their response, overall child welfare organizations missed opportunities to provide a comprehensive, coordinated, and timely response, and, in addition, the criminal justice system missed opportunities to bring the perpetrators to justice. You're awfully quiet, Felicity.
I'm listening.
More on Rochdale. This led to the imprisonment of 9 men convicted of grooming girls as young as 10 in Rochdale, England. The gang bought their victims gifts and plied them with alcohol before forcing them to have sex with multiple men. The high-profile investigation by Greater Manchester Police identified more than 40 potential victims. When you look at this and you compare it to the statistics that we just gave, this is a drop in the bucket. But still, it goes to show the mentality of society that is able to look the other way, which brings us to a public misled. Soon after 1974, when CAPTA was initiated, child abuse reports skyrocketed, and a concerted effort by the backlash to protect and defend abusers and remove therapists, mandatory reporters, teachers, and any other groups who advocated for children, as well as to sway public opinion, was also initiated. And so we have people ask who would support pedophiles. And it's not the question of who would support pedophiles. Their argument is who would support those who were wrongly convicted of abuse. The most misleading myth in all of this is that every case of abuse about Satanism or satanic abuse, and it always ties every child abuse case back to the satanic panic, uprising to the late 80s and early 90s. Now, I like Felicity's comment when she says that the only people who were afraid during satanic panic were the abusers and pedophiles who were molesting children. Those were the only people that were panicking. That there was no panic before, it was simple interest on television. Do you want to jump in, Felicity, and make a comment about that, or?
Well, the time period is interesting because during the 80s and 90s, this is when this public stuff started coming out. Previous to the 80s, CAPTA was formed in 1974. The statistics of child abuse was just huge. There were so many people coming forward, especially survivors were coming forward and telling their stories. Therapists, victims of child abuse were coming forward. And then when all of this backlash, we'll say, started coming in during the 80s, then the amount of child abuse cases dropped dramatically as teachers, CPS, mandatory reporters were being threatened, became afraid to report cases. Then they went down in the 80s. So I just wanted to say that it's an interesting jump up in the 70s and then back down in the 80s and 90s, and some of it's still going on today.
I see. There is a man who is involved that we will get involved with further in this conversation, he goes by Doug Mesner. His real name is Doug Masico. He also goes by Lucian Graves. And an example of how this myth has been set up for satanic panic in theirs is citizens' allegations against him are not plausible at all. These allegations appear to be yet another attempt by fanatical satanic ritual abuse promoters to inject SRA scenarios into and hijack whatever sex crime story currently dominates public interest and concern. They have tried to do this with pedophile rings, clergy child sex abuse, institutional child sex abuse, child trafficking and prostitution, child pornography, and on and on. This is a potentially disastrous circumstance for genuine victims. If a sizable proportion of allegations against Jimmy Savile turn out to be satanic ritual abuse scenarios coming out of the SRA mind control survivors cult, the plausibility of all allegations against him would be cast into doubt. This is the twist, the, shall we call it, the woo-woo technique that they use to actually present an argument and then turn it against itself so that it doesn't make any sense. It has been my experience in Omaha, Nebraska, that there were heavy connections to the church. There were heavy connections to the military. It was satanic for me, but if I may, Felicity, I can say it was not satanic for Felicity. And so to say that everyone's abuse with sex crimes and all of that is satanic in nature is to throw the baby out with the bathwater. You're really throwing the whole situation out of the window, even though all of these things could very well be connected. And it's not Satanists that we're looking for so much as we are child traffickers and pedophiles. You know, it brings it a little bit more down to earth. So how have we been misled? Well, the other side has been able to utilize the system, which is the public, to do their bidding by creating laws to protect the abusers and banish the therapists, teachers, reporting agencies, and the public who are meant to support the children. There is a lawyer out there who is a heavy FMS leader. He goes by the name of Christopher Barden. And he says, following successful efforts to reform the emergency medical system for children, Dr. Barden began systematic efforts to reform the mental health system. Using a five-prong approach of education, regulation, litigation, legislation, and prosecution, Dr. Barden focused on eliminating dangerous pseudoscientific notions, such as recovered memory therapy, multiple personality disorder, so on. Thanks to the collaborative, multidisciplinary efforts of scientists, concerned families, mental health practitioners, and attorneys, after 10 years of successful litigation, legislative hearings, prosecutions, and licensing actions, these dangerous junk science methods and procedures have been greatly reduced or eradicated from the United States. Dr. Barden's current projects include reform efforts in the family law, mental health licensing, public education, and criminal justice systems. So we have these very powerful people who are being used to enact laws that actually help the accused get off and get help to basically go reoffend again, in my opinion. And so they're using the media to mislead. And if you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. That was written by Joseph Goebbels. Is that right, Felicity? Do you know Goebbels?
That's Hitler. That would be Hitler's big guy.
Yeah, it comes from, you know, a lot of this comes from Nazi ways of thinking. But use the media in any way possible to sway public opinion, whether the information is correct or not, and only report news which indicates or creates the idea that child abuse exploitation is non-existent. Now you wonder who, you know, to give a good example of that, the statistics showed that 2,185 children were being reported missing a day. And yet, how long did we have to watch the Casey Anthony trial on television? A year and a half. So while we're watching one child, one crime, one prosecution of one criminal, who got off, by the way, you have 2,185 kids disappearing a day, and that's not counting the kids who are hitting the streets unreported and are finding themselves into this exploitation, and sex trafficking ring. There's, why don't you read the next one, the example that you wrote down, Felicity, because you have a little bit more to say, I think, about this.
Okay. This was a quote from Debbie Nathan. She's a woman who just recently wrote a book called Sybil Exposed, which was her attempt to demonstrate in this book that the whole Sybil story was all made up, all connived by these women to make a lot of money. And it was basically to discredit not only Shirley Mason, who was the Sybil person, to discredit her, to discredit the doctor, to discredit everything and every part of this book. And she even tried to conclude that because the Sybil book was all a lie, that it was all connected to satanic ritual abuse and the satanic panic, a very poor effort to bring about the idea that there really isn't any dissociative identity disorder, there really isn't any child abuse. And this is kind of their style. And what they do through the media is they play up that, like, they'll take one little instance, like the McMartin case, and try to prove, make movies, whatever, that these were made up, they didn't happen. So this is a little quote from one of the many media pieces that she put out. And she writes, "Sorry, a long-delayed apology from one of the accusers in the notorious McMartin preschool molestation case." As told to Debbie Nathan, Kyle Zerpola is a 30-year-old former McMartin preschool student who now manages a supermarket on California's Central Coast. Debbie Nathan is a writer in New York and co-author with appellate attorney Michael Snedeker of Satan's Silence Ritual Abuse in the Making of a Modern American Witch Hunt. She also is a board member of the National Center for Reason and Justice, a nonprofit group that works to educate the public about people who are falsely charged with child abuse. This is really common of what you'll see from these people. They'll take a little bit and make it big. So they're trying to show that this person is now grown up. He's very, he's very affluential, and he's saying sorry that he lied, or sorry, So this is real common in the public. Build it up and make it look like nothing really happened.
A good example of what Felicity is talking about is that McMartin was but one of 7 daycares in the area who reported the exact same problems. One of them was a Long Beach Catholic church that was involved as well. We had cases at the Presidio Daycare in San Francisco, and there were cases in Atlanta, there were cases, and all of these cases were popping up all over the place. And so they focused on the McMartin case. They made a big spectacle out of the McMartin case, and yet after the McMartin case was done, there was a group of people who went in, and they were forensic archaeologists who spent 3 days digging and finding not only the rooms and tunnels that the children talk about, but they also found relics that were involved in the dig. And so it just gave credence to what the children had been saying all along. Not to mention that the children were coming home with STDs. And so unless you believe that someone coughed and their child caught gonorrhea from a cough, there had to be something going on. And so the other implications of looking away from all of this and turning our back is that the child exploitation trafficking business is an estimated $32 billion a year industry. This includes not only those who directly profit from such activities, but also benefit those in the legal system in the way of attorneys who defend abusers, like our friend that we will talk about a little bit more, expert witnesses, which Debbie Nathan is not and never has been. But that includes doctors, law officials, attorneys, etc., and the False Memory Foundation, who work at discrediting the victim and presenting the therapist, teacher, or reporting agency as incompetent in order to sway public opinion. Such concerted effort has an effect on such things as jury pools, who have been swayed into defending perpetrators by media manipulation, who many times in the past have hailed the accused and incarcerated or sued the whistleblowers, who are either victims of the abuse or their advocates. Good example of that in Omaha, Nebraska is Alicia Owen. She came forth, said she had been molested by the chief of police of Omaha, and she went to jail, and she spent the most time in solitary of any other inmate in Nebraska. Felicity, would you like to say something? Excuse me.
You're doing great, Tom.
Okay. Misinformation culprits. Okay, this is where we're starting to get into who is basically spinning the situation to keep it from getting out. One of the people that's out there, he goes by, again, the name Doug Mesner. His name is Doug Masico, but he also goes under Lucian Graves. And he is an elected False Memory Foundation spokesperson and founder of the Satanic Club that promotes his beliefs on the internet. He has pictures of, is it the Satanic Church? I believe, and we wanted to put a little bit about his philosophy about accepted therapy on trauma and therapy. This school of therapy breeds conspiracy theory and literally indoctrinates clients into false beliefs in a satanic threat. Clients are encouraged to remember episodes of abuse that are presumed to have concealed them from their conscious minds, and when the evidence doesn't match their confabulated false memories, they explain it away as evidence as a much larger conspiracy, a satanic conspiracy. With the false veneer of science, these experts in dissociation have kept a witch hunt alive. Innocent people have been convicted and imprisoned in the evidence of recovered memory testimony, even though this is the exact same evidence we have for alien abduction and is the same therapeutic process by which people practice past life regression. I have a long and complex body of writing, so one of my own goals is to destroy this harmful pseudoscientific practice and dispel the myth of an international satanic conspiracy. The broader goal of the Satanic Temple in general is to advocate for all those who are unjustly maligned, demonized, or marginalized, victimized by conspiracy theorists and dogmatic supernaturalists. Now, this is an interview that was done on August 4th, 2013, where Doug Mesner interviewed himself as Lucian Greaves. So take it for what it's worth. But personally, I think that Doug Mesner is nothing more than a distraction to keep from the real Satanist, who is Colonel Mike Aquino, my personal handler and head of the Temple of Set, and they just had a conference where members of 4 continents joined in, and so to say that the Antichrist business is doing well is pretty much an understatement. I'm getting ready to write an article for Paranoia magazine by Ron Patton, published by Ron Patton, and it'll be about Colonel Aquino and how Doug Mesner is trying to distract from the real Satanist who is involved with this. So, more on Mesner. According to the Satanic Temple website, a temple spokesperson who goes by the name Lucian Greaves officiated the ceremonies while wearing horned headgear, and then proceeded to put his penis on Johnston's grave. I do believe that because of Phelps' beliefs, he is now obligated to believe his mother is gay in the afterlife, he said. This was published in the Huffington Post. As you can see, we have pictures. Felicity made me tone down the picture that really, I think, explains who Doug Mesner is. And you can see that is the first picture. But you can also go to my site, davidshurter.com. That's SHURTER, and actually see the real picture and see how sad this whole thing really is. We probably should edit that. Felicity, you're not saying anything.
I'm listening.
All right. Author Debbie Nathan. Who is Debbie Nathan? Well, Felicity spoke a little bit about Debbie Nathan, author of Sybil Exposed. She is an unofficial spokesperson for the National Center for Reason and Justice. And those people are people who educate lawyers, journalists, students, and the public about fear-mongering, junk science, and unfair criminal justice practices. Acts as a tax-deductible fiscal sponsor for community groups supporting the innocent of charges of child abuse. They're talking about accused pedophiles. Partners with Innocence Projects and other attorneys to overturn wrongful convictions of child abuse. We're not talking any other abuse, we're talking child abuse. Promotes laws, investigation, treatment, and penalties based on science and good sense, and seeks justice for both the innocent and the guilty of child abuse. So basically what they have done, and we will talk about it in a little while, Felicity has a little bit more to say about this, but they have put the whistleblowers and the therapists in jail and basically herald the bad guys as the victims of the case. The National Center for Reason and Justice also encourages the public to feel badly for the convicted child abusers by corresponding with prisoners or a former prisoner. Those still behind bars especially need regular messages of support from those who are on the outside of walls. Now that I'm not advocating saying that we shouldn't support people who are in jail. However, just supporting any arbitrary person convicted of pedophilia, I think, is unhealthy, unwise, and unsound. That's just how I feel. Sybil and the false memory spin. We wanted to talk a little bit about Sybil and the problems that we had with it. And so Debbie Nathan, in her book Sybil Exposed, asserts that 3 women who were involved with the detailing of the abuse and mental breakdown of Sybil all conspired in a coffee shop to make money off of a diagnosis that was unheard of in its time. In the last 2 chapters of her book, Sybil Exposed, entitled Contagion and Containment, Nathan then asserts that a book written 10 years before our problem was satanic ritual abuse, which was written by a woman who never claimed she was abused in such a way, somehow infiltrated the minds of these hysterical women who all had therapists, convincing them that they had multiple personality disorders and were implanting memories into their brains. Although the children, like those at McMartin and the 7 other daycares in the same area, one of which was a Long Beach Catholic church, were not only coming home with tales of ritualistic sexual exploitation, but they were also coming home with STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. And so this side will say that those of us who believe what happened and believe the facts of the matter are conspiracy theorists, and yet they believe all of this stuff that couldn't possibly be true. Felicity, do you want to jump in and just share a minute?
Well, Debbie Nathan's book, Sybil Exposed, it's interesting that some people accept this now. But when this book was written, back, I don't know, when Sybil came out, like, I don't know, in the 70s, I think. I read it.
73.
I was around back then. The book Sybil was well accepted. It's been, as you follow through time, that it would take until now for Sybil Exposed to be accepted, and it's interesting that the public opinion has changed so much till now, where they'll easily accept something like this. I mean, it's the public. The way the public has changed in their way of thinking is amazing. And amazing to me is that this backlash, we'll call it, has had 30 years to sway public opinion, and it's interesting how they did it.
It is interesting how they did it. And so let's talk about them. Who is the false memory people? Who are the false memory people? Who is the False Memory Syndrome Foundation? Now, I do not call them the Syndrome Foundation, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, because it was determined that it wasn't a syndrome. False memories don't exist, and they never have. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation was established in 1992 as an advocacy organization for people claiming to be falsely accused of sexual abuse. The foundation was formed primarily through the efforts of Peter and Pamela Freud, step-siblings and husband and wife. They became aware that their adult daughter had begun to disclose to her husband that her father had sexually abused her as a child. Their daughter, Professor Jennifer Freud, is a respected professor in psychology who has since written extensively on the impact of child abuse on memory. Assisting the Freuds was Dr. Ralph Underwager, a minister-turned-therapist who had testified for the defense in over 200 child abuse cases, including the Mr. Bubbles ritual abuse case in Sydney. He had previously established victims of child abuse laws to advocate for people whose children were removed from them by Child Protection Services for child abuse. Underwager would step down from the board of the foundation in 1993 after giving an interview in which he stated that pedophilia was blessed by God. That interview actually is on my website, davidshurter.com, in the top, and the interview was done by Patica magazine, where he not only says that pedophilia was blessed by God, but goes on and talks all kinds about pedophilia. With the assistance of Underwager and others, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation established an advisory board with a number of prominent academics and began to promulgate the notion of false memory syndrome. Although for the academic and popular press, the foundation defined FMSF as a social phenomenon of epidemic proportions, in which misguided therapists cause patients to invent memories of sexual abuse. Regarding the backlashers, now we've called them the backlashers, and we wanted to talk a little bit about what the backlashers do. And so there have been a number of concerns about the activities of the FMSF, including the foundation's founders and members diagnosed thousands of people with false memory syndrome without actually ever meeting them. The FMSF confabulates figures to create an epidemic of false memory syndrome for which there is no epidemiological evidence. The foundation accepts all denials of sexual abuse as true without asking for evidence, while stating that memories of sexual abuse are likely to be false unless there is evidence. The foundation founders and members have engaged in campaigns of harassment, defamation, and intimidation against adults complaining of sexual abuse and the professionals who provide them with care. The foundation's founders and members have regularly threatened legal action to silence their critics, and have a history of unsuccessful court action against others for defamation, e.g. Freud and Freud versus Whitfield, Underwager and Wakefield versus Salter. They basically have just sued each other back and forth to make major issues out of nothing, and it's all just one small group doing it. The foundation's founders and members have deliberately misrepresented cases of sexual abuse in order to further their personal and political goals. And the board members of the foundation make a considerable amount of money as expert witnesses as part of the defense teams for people accused of sexual abuse and other crimes. So basically, they're making money going to court and suing whistleblowers to shut everybody up. So, what they say, it's how I've heard it said. What do you call 500 lawyers at the bottom of the ocean? A good start. And so, Felicity, you can jump in anytime. In fact, why don't you jump in and talk about our Christopher Barden? Because this is... Go ahead.
I wanted to say a little bit about the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. When they came around, and I don't think they're very active right now because all of their theories are getting blown out of the water. They never had any empirical evidence anyhow about their theories. They came around about the time that like I said, in 1990 time, that the child abuse cases that were reported went way down. So we can only come to the conclusion that their efforts had caused a drop in abuse cases being reported, which is a shame. So we can talk about our Christopher Barden, who was a very important part of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. In fact, if you go back to their heyday, which was in the 90s, there was actually on the False Memory Syndrome Foundation website an advertisement for people who were being treated by therapists and who had child abuse backgrounds to come in and sue their therapists, make lots of money, which was interesting. That advertisement isn't there anymore. But Christopher Barden is our Christopher Barden, JD, PhD, LP, lots of letters behind his name, and lots of letters behind his name. So he's a national expert in psychology. This came from his website, actually. And law. Dr. Barden is a licensed psychologist, clinical and forensic, licensed attorney, research scientist, speaker, writer, and national science legislation consultant. He has published in the leading journals in child psychology, social psychology, clinical psychology, psychiatry, and law. Dr. Barden helped draft and enact successful national health care legislation. Dr. Barden has been interviewed regarding complex science and legal issues by U.S. Congressional Quarterly, CBS 60 Minutes, ABC Nightline, the CBS Evening News, Time Magazine, Newsweek Magazine, U.S. News and World Report Magazine, Insight Magazine, The New Yorker, the LA Times, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the London BBC, U.S. National Public Radio, ABC News 2020, National German Television, National Finnish TV, 60 Minutes Australia, Canadian Public Radio, PBC Frontline, NBC Dateline, and many other media services. See, they use the media a lot. Following successful efforts to reform the emergency medical system for children, Dr. Barden began systematic efforts to reform the mental health system using a five-prong approach of education, regulation, litigation, legislation, and prosecution. Dr. Barden focused on eliminating what he and the backlash call dangerous pseudoscientific notions such as, and in quotes, recovered memory therapy, multiple personality disorder, and coercive holding therapies. Thanks to the collaborative, multidisciplinary efforts of science, concerned families, mental health practitioners, and attorneys, after 10 years of successful civil litigation, legislative hearings, prosecutions, and licensing actions, these dangerous junk science methods and procedures have been greatly reduced or eradicated across the United States. Dr. Barden's current projects include reform efforts in family law, mental health licensing, public education, and criminal justice systems. That says exactly what the backlash has done since the 90s. Exactly what he just wrote there. Now, he puts it out there as if this is all a good thing, but what he's actually saying is that the actual accepted mental health theories, like multiple personality disorder that's now called dissociative identity disorder and is in the DSM-5, and recovered memory therapy, that's coined by the FMSF. There really isn't any such thing. He's saying that he's getting rid of this junk science, which is actually the accepted science for trauma and dissociation. So he's going to get rid of the accepted science by promoting his idea that dissociative identity disorder is therapy-induced, that multiple personality disorder comes from therapists implanting personalities in their clients. All of this is not proved by any empirical evidence. The FMSF folks, or the backlash we'll call them, what they do is they write books, they write articles, and they source themselves circular. So there's never been any empirical evidence for anything they say, and in fact, they source each other. So it looks to the public like this is real scientific stuff that they're throwing out there. So I'll stop here before I ramble any further.
No, that was excellent information. I also wanted to add with that people need to realize that they have inundated social media. They are everywhere. As you hear from Christopher Barton, he's involved in everything. And so these people are trying to redo legislation that help protect children and redo it for the pedophiles' benefit. And they're doing it by inundating the media and really trying to get everyone focused and thinking one way, even though it doesn't make any sense. Which brings us to the question, who are the victims? The answer to this question should be obvious. We all become victims of this eventually. The victims are the children, teens, and adults who continue to be abused, and the public whose children and resources are being exploited. Now, less obvious are the shrouded victims, those whose job it is to report but whose hands are tied with threats of lawsuits, who are unable to protect our children. That includes therapists, teachers especially, child protective service workers. Their hands are tied. The False Memory Foundation has helped to create a society that is blinded by misinformation that the backlash has propagated. The professionals have been swayed by threats to their careers and personal well-being, which has been systematically carried out in court systems and in their personal lives. Survivors have been re-traumatized and silenced when hearing of the harassment of others who have reported the same threats that kept them silent as children in the first place. And professionals have been made to conform to the practices initiated by the backlash, who protect and defend abusers and those whose financial success is dependent on the continuation of sexual abuse and exploitation. In the end, we all eventually become victims of this, paying the cost of looking away. That brings us to Katherine Hines' article. Felicity found this. It is a brilliant article. It is entitled Retaliation Against Professionals Who Report Child Abuse. And why don't you go ahead and talk a little bit about this and take over this part, Felicity, because you really did find this and you're well versed in it.
Okay, well, I was researching for this little project we're doing, and I wanted to show the history and how we've come to be where we are today. And I found this article that actually said everything that I was trying to say much better than I was doing. So I decided to put it in here. I hope it's okay with her if she sees this. Her name is Katherine Hine. She's a family attorney licensed in Ohio and Oklahoma. She's a board member of the Ross County Network for Children, the Ross County Family Violence Council, and Our Children, Our Future Charitable Foundation. She has published articles on child protective system, prepared amicus curiae briefs, conducted custody trials involving allegations of abuse, and argued appeals in family violence cases affecting children. She's a single mother of 4, 2 of whom still live with her at home in Ohio. I'm not exactly sure when this article was written. So I like what it says. Okay. She wrote, this is a quote out of her article, and where there's like 3 little dots is where I just kind of left it out so it wouldn't be as long as, I didn't want it that long. The longest standing target of retaliation against professional child advocates appears to be the mental health professional, as reports of children suspected of being abused or neglected increased 20-fold from approximately 150,000 to 3 million between 1963 and 1993, at the same time that adult victims of child abuse were seeking healing in support groups and in the offices of mental health professionals. It is common and usual for any reform movement, after it achieves a certain measure of public support and sympathy, as did child protection during the 1970s and 80s, to be subjected to an opposition movement. In the context of child protection, that opposition movement has come to be known to advocates as the backlash. The anti-child protection backlash presents itself as being unopposed to the publicly accepted goals of the child protection reform movement. It can be politically unwise and openly oppose the concept of child protection. The methods of child protection are said to be disputed by such backlash groups as the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. In 1991, the year before the formation of the FMSF, more than 80% of news coverage in the popular press about child sexual abuse was weighted toward histories of survivors and the nature of childhood trauma. Now we have to remember, FMSF was started in 1993. Now by 1994, more than 80% of news focus was on false accusations and the newly coined concept of the false memory syndrome. So previous to the False Memory Syndrome Foundation coming out, the news media was for children, listening to survivors, listening to victims, and trying to figure out how to solve the problem. Now, just 1 year later, the news coverage is weighted towards false accusations. The term false memory syndrome has never been accepted as a valid condition either.
It is not in the DSM.
No, it's nowhere. It's coined by the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Right.
Okay, let's look at mental health professionals. This is really shocking. I was not aware how bad this was. I knew a couple of people that were charged. I knew a couple of people that were harassed, but I didn't know to what lengths until I read this. By the late 80s and early 90s, attack upon mental health professionals began. The identified abusers of the adult victims of child abuse began to avail themselves of new third-party liability theories upon which they based litigation against their adult children's therapists. Those theories would be stuff like, therapists implant memories in their clients' brains and stuff like that. Bowman and Mertz describe with alarm the recent emergence of these increasingly novel legal theories formulated specifically for use in lawsuits in civil court, seeking damages against therapists treating adult child sexual abuse survivors. Patients who are or were satisfied with the targeted therapist. The intensity of the attack on mental health professionals escalated in 1997 with the bringing of federal indictments against Houston mental health professionals Judy Peterson, Richard Seward, Gloria Caraga, I hope I say these names right, Sylvia Davis, and hospital administrator George Jerry Muick. Now, these are all PhDs or MDs or MSWs. The defendants faced possible sentence of, now hang on to your hat, life imprisonment without parole, apparently because the government disagreed with the diagnosis and treatment of 7 patients who claimed to have been falsely convinced that they had been victims of child abuse. Following 5 months of testimony in 1998 and 99 by 33 government witnesses and dozens of audio and videotapes offered in evidence, a mistrial was declared in February 1999 after the dismissals of all but 11 jury members. The results of an informal jury poll showed that despite the fact that the defense had not yet presented its case, the jurors were strongly inclined toward acquittal. On March 1st, 1999, the government dismissed all charges against the 5 defendants. However, the legal costs for the defendants and the government were staggering. Okay, now I just want to say that was publicized, and If I were a therapist, I would be
Terrified.
not wanting to treat anybody that had child abuse. I mean, this sent chills through the entire country that you could be brought in front of a court with a possible sentence of life imprisonment without parole because your client, might say that they didn't actually have child abuse. I just had to throw that in there.
Well, it basically is a fear factor.
Yeah.
It keeps people incredibly terrified to actually reach out and help. And if they get close to it, they generally shy away, which leaves, let's talk about the cases due to the backlash. Why don't you keep going, because this is some of your research. But there were cases of fear-mongering that this group was going on. They went completely out of their way to trash people. And so go ahead if you want to continue, Felicity.
This is about a Pennsylvania clinician named Jim Singer. He was stripped of his professional license in apparent retaliation against his efforts to assist a 15-year-old suicidal child who had disclosed incident of sexual abuse. His suit against various entities in the state of Pennsylvania, instrumental in the removal of his license, at one time reached a federal court of appeals. Singer's case prompted then Congressman, now Governor, Tom Ridge to comment in a letter asking U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno to address Singer's case. Dr. Singer had been labeled a criminal. He lost his license, and he has spent thousands of dollars pleading his case, thus depleting his resources. This case is a perfect example of what is quickly becoming a national problem. Child advocates have stated that although child abuse continues to increase, the number of cases reported has decreased. The reason is simple. Mandated reporters fear retaliation, and their fear is legitimate enough that they are willing to risk children's lives by ignoring the abuse. And that was also written by Katherine Hine. Although an ethics complaint filed with the American Psychological Association was dismissed, Singer continues, as of this writing, to be able to practice as a clinician. Other clinicians against whom apparently spurious civil suits have been filed include Dr. Kathleen Thaler, a well-known researcher and co-author of judicial training curriculum sponsored by the American Bar Association and the National Organization of Women Legal Defense Fund, memory and abuse author Dr. Charles Whitfield, former Treating Abuse Today editor David Califf, and Dr. Laura S. Brown, former professor of clinical psychology at the University of Washington. These clinicians who testified, especially if they do so repeatedly in family court, have become equally vulnerable to litigation. Linda Palmer and Celia Owens Beckham of Oklahoma, and Dr. Mary Froning of the District of Columbia, even making a report apparently too favorable to the credibility of the abuse disclosing child can provoke retaliation, i.e. Dr. Pamela Hall of New Jersey, Dr. Leslie Rudy of Ohio, Susan Jones, formerly of New Hampshire, Dr. Virginia Humphrey of California, Dr. Daphne J. Tommins, and Dr. J. W. Scott Wallace of North Carolina. Although Drs. Timmons and Wallace were vindicated, Christopher Barden, an attorney who has filed many suits against therapists, states such victories for accused therapists are very rare. This just goes to show that the backlash, Christopher Barden didn't just go after small, therapists. He went after people who were authors, doctors, lawyers, anybody that he could go after, and he was winning one after the other with this whole false memory, therapists implant memories in people's brains. These were being accepted by juries, these silly theories, and still are today.
And there's a lot of fear. There's still a lot of fear. And so that is the reason why Felicity and I are getting together and doing more of these webinars that we're giving away completely for free to educate the public as to exactly what's been going on and how it's been working and how it's happened and how we have found ourselves in this position. Which brings us to the conclusion of this webinar. And number one, we want to make sure that people know there is a concerted effort to protect child abusers, which is the reason why we have the issues with child trafficking and exploitation that we do. Number two, the backlash from CAPTA has reversed laws regarding the protection of victims, and legislation has been implemented to protect the abusers of children. Number three, our nation's problems with child trafficking has grown exponentially until we now have an estimated $36 billion a year problem with the exploitation of children. Number four, whistleblowers have been attacked and destroyed until there is very little help for those victims who have been abused sexually in their past. Number five, the media has been used to spur these actions. And number six, until we realize that abuse is generally understood, that abuse is generally understated rather than overreported, our children will continue to be used in systematic and deplorable ways. It is going to take all of us to the system of abuse that has been implemented in the past few decades and reverse the damage that has been done by the backlashers. The only way to do that is to educate and to share. Felicity, why don't you give your contact information and a little bit information about your website before we end?
Well, I kind of wanted to go back to the beginning of
that is fine.
Of this presentation. I don't know if people remember, but somewhere in the presentation, it was stated that before the backlash came along, before the FMSF came along, remember I said that the media coverage and the focus was on listening to survivors, right? Do you remember that?
Right.
And also listening to the victims and of child abuse, survivors of child abuse, and trying to work together, because it was a new law. We're fairly new to protecting children in this country. But the focus was on what to do to help survivors of child abuse, to help victims of child abuse to listen, and that was the focus. I remember that was in our presentation. And then, like a year later, the FMSF came along, and remember that it was stated that 80% of the media was now focused on false memories, false accusations. So my thought is that if there is any way to go back to that time where the public and the media go back to listening to the abuse, listening to the survivors, listening to the victims, as we saw in that one case of the 105 victims they found, nobody listened, because nobody has listened since the false memory syndrome came around, since back to that time in 1991. And that was the way it should have gone. That's the way the world should have proceeded, where we listened to the survivors, we listened to the victims, and the media was on what we should do to use this law and protect our children and the victims of child abuse. So we need to find a way to go back to that time. And the only way we can go back to that time is to throw out all this trash that the backlash has been feeding us for the last, 20, 30 years? We need to dump all that. There's no empirical evidence that therapists can implant memories. There's no empirical evidence that memories are false. I'm a child abuse survivor, and I know what happened to me. I have a memory. My memories aren't false. We need to start talking to the survivors, because I would venture to say that most people would admit that they have memories and they're not false. So I'm just thinking that if there was a way that, we could go back, and I think there is. It's just that history has a way of playing out. So,
and repeating itself.
Oh, and my website is Ivory Garden. The support group, which, they don't like support groups much, but Our support group is quite active, and it's a wonderful place to go. It's private. It's www.igd. Let me start over. www.igdid, as in Ivory Garden DID, and it will show up, so you'll see it. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much, Felicity. And that concludes the first webinar that we've done. And we appreciate all of you who are taking the time to listen and to educate yourself on these issues and who have given us support. I want to thank Felicity for just the amazing support that she has been able to provide and the education and research. And we can make a difference. We all can if we all work together. And so it is August 25th, 2013, and that concludes the politics of child abuse. So thank you very much.